Tempest's interpretation of that. Curiosity. I'm afraid this half is going to be rather less fun. It's the science bit, so I'm sorry about that. So thanks for staying. I think I've given most of you a questionnaire. I'm sorry that you get a questionnaire for everything you do these days. It's too well funding. And I think I've messed up the folding. So it folds the wrong way. So I'm sure you'll work it out. If you could fill it in, and then as you go out of the door, there's a piano opposite with a shoebox there. If you could pop it in there, it would be really, really great. Okay, I'm not going to talk for too long. You'll be glad to know. I want to talk to you tonight about two things, really. Firstly, I wish to examine how a tavern in the northeastern suburbs of Elizabethan and Jacobean London came to be imagined as exotic, a place you could journey to for a few days or a few hours escape from the pressures of daily life. If you like, a new world, a newfound land. With that in mind, secondly, I want to say a little bit about the relationship of this text, and Hoxton generally, to Shakespeare's last complete play, The Tempest. How Pimlico can be considered a minor but significant source for The Tempest, and how reading this text forces us to see The Tempest in a much more local context. A play not simply about the universal themes of love and loss, of exploration and colonisation, of redemption and forgiveness, but also about London, about the practices in the everyday lives of people living in and around this city. So what was Hoxton or Hoxton like in the early 17th century? Well, it was a small village with some fine houses, but also known for market gardening. By the time this text was published, 1609, it had just about become a part of the main conurbation, as development stretched out from Bishopsgate along the old Roman road Ermine Street, modern-day Shoreditch High Street and Kingsland Road, which goes out to East Anglia and the north. Now, it's relatively well known that the suburbs of London at this time were places of resort, of leisure, where inns, theatres, brothels and gambling dens competed for the custom of Londoners. By far the best known example of this in our culture is south of the river, Bankside and Southwark, with the Globe, Shakespeare's Globe, now of course recreated as its centrepiece, where for various legal reasons the puritanical authorities of the City of London had difficulty in controlling the entertainment industry sited south of the river. But the northeastern suburbs, Shoreditch, Clerkenwell and Hoxton, had a vibrant leisure culture as well, with a number of theatres and in-yard theatres, including the theatre, supposedly, in fact, probably not, in fact, the first purpose-built theatre in England since the Romans, and the Curtain, the remains of which has recently been discovered, of course, in Plough Yard in Shoreditch. Alongside these were taverns and brothels to service the punters. Shakespeare himself lived in the 1580s and 90s in Bishopsgate and Shoreditch, and the area has been described as the Quartier Latin of late Elizabethan London, home to wits, intellectuals, bawds, and of course, whores. I'd like to draw a strong comparison between then and now. The City of London now has its own local government and police force, with strict licensing laws and planning regulations. So it's the areas around the city, Spitalfields, Shoreditch, Hoxton, Smithfields, that you have to go if you want to go clubbing till 6 in the morning, to find a space to be creative, or to put on an experimental play. So Hoxton, then as now, was a place on the margins, not country, not town, both inside and outside, both familiar and strange and surprising. The northeastern suburbs have for 2 millennia been a place where undesirable elements were sent. The Romans buried their dead outside Bishopsgate at the start of Ermine Street. In the Middle Ages, those who were sick of body and mind were sent here to Bethlehem Hospital or Bedlam, which was originally sited on what is now Liverpool Street Station. And right up until the early 19th century, Hoxton had a thriving industry of private madhouses or asylums for those deemed incapable of living in society. But in this madness, if you like, in the unconscious or id to the city's ego and superego, there is also a space to play, to act, to be someone other to oneself, to experience freedoms not usually allowed in the highly regulated city. Stowe, who wrote the Survey of London, which is a kind of systematic description of London in 1603, describes the various leisure activities going on in the northern suburbs. So on Moorfields and Spitalfields there was archery practice, and he likes this as a very virtuous activity. And he likes the sort of market gardening that goes on in Hoxton. What he doesn't like are the various sort of leisure gardening, but he doesn't mention it, but I think he means Pimlico. Which, as he says, not so much for use or profit as for show and pleasure. So, you know, there are these two, there's the virtuous activities according to Stowe anyway, and the vicious ones. So it's in the taverns and theatres, and yes, in the brothels and gambling dens, and the drunkenness of Pimlico, that we find concrete expressions of this desire to play outside oneself, to play a part, to be someone other to oneself. How is one to represent such a place? In what I've said hitherto, I've used terms from Freudian psychoanalysis, from psychogeography, and from cultural anthropology. If you don't have access to these discourses, as our anonymous writer in 1609 clearly didn't, what vocabulary can one use to talk about this strangeness? Well, as we've already said, there's the madness about it. And you know, that's no accident, because Bedlam was and various other mental asylums were close to this spot. There's the theatres, the experience of playing a part, both in the audience and on the stage. And there's also something I haven't talked about, the beginning of the poem, the second part of what you've just seen. There's something that I call urban pastoral. So there's a kind of mixing of the rural pastoral with a kind of urban aesthetic as well. But the main image, the most striking image in this poem, I think, is that of a journey to the new world, a place both alluring and frightening, magical and bewitching. Now, London from the 1580s onwards was a city awash with stories of the new world, as this was the time of the first English attempts to establish colonies on the eastern seaboard of North America. The sailors and entrepreneurs involved in these expeditions brought back stories of the New World for various reasons: publicity, propaganda, but also genuine wonder. And these stories were widely circulated. It is clear that the author of Pimlico is using these stories. I won't go into the technicalities of which texts he's using, but it's fairly obvious that he has some in common with those used by Shakespeare when writing The Tempest. And he asks, particularly at the start, questions like this. He asks, is this a part of the continent or an island? And that was the first thing that anyone journeying to America had to put on finding land. They had to establish whether it was an island or a continent. What resources are there to sustain life? In Pimlico we find that there's all sorts of meat there, and there's obviously bawdy puns on meat. What resources are there that you might be able to sell? Are there any commodities that might be able to be sold back to the old world? And what are the dangers, he asks? Disease and drunkenness, particularly, of course, drunkenness with Native Americans who had had no alcohol before. How is the governor of the colony to keep order amongst the colonists? How equally are the colonials or the colonists going to manage their relationship with the indigenous population? Once it's been established that there is a potential for a lucrative commercial operation, how is one to ensure the maximum profit? And what about the competitors? How are you going to ensure exclusivity from the Portuguese, the Spanish, and the Dutch? We also find there's competition from the theatres in Pimlico and competition from other pubs as well. Later on in the poem, the action moves to the Mediterranean, prompted by names of the other taverns, such as the Malta and the Turk's Head. Competition between taverns is figured as exploration, conquest, and the attempt to monopolise. So what starts out being a journey to a kind of utopia of social equality and plentiful resources ends up being a battle to monopolise the market and to extract every profit possible, which might in fact be a good description of most colonial projects. And in some ways, the poem Pimlico ends up being an advert for beer and for the tavern. And I like the way this beer was put on this stool. It looks very much like a modern day commercial for beer. Large production. I think there's Stella Artois first when he comes back from the war, and there's this kind of the amber nectar on the bar. I just want to pause for a moment to talk about one other aspect of Pimlico, and its links to the New World. There is off modern-day North Carolina a stretch of water called Pamlico Sound, derived from a name for the Native American people, Pantico, living there when the English arrived there in the late 16th century. At the northern point of Pamlico Sound lies the island of Roanoke, the site of the famous Lost Colony, set up by Sir Walter Raleigh and others. It has recently been plausibly argued that the name Pimlico derives from this New World place name, and that the shadowy Ben Pimlico was one of two men by the name of Ben or Bennett that were listed as being on a ship that brought back the disillusioned colonists to London in 1588. This connection can't be proven, but there's quite a lot of circumstantial evidence that suggests that it probably is the case of the earliest example of a New World name being used in England. So the reverse of what one would usually expect. The problems and possibilities of cultural exchange and interacting with new peoples brings us nicely to the subject of the Tempest, which is the second thing I wish to talk about. It is now agreed by almost all scholars that Shakespeare had in mind and borrowed from a number of sources relating to the unsuccessful expeditions to the New World in the 1580s and the ultimately successful ones to set up Jamestown from 1507 onwards when he was writing the Tempest. From this observation comes an interpretation of the Tempest as a kind of reenactment of the colonial encounter and a way of measuring the moral authority of supposedly sophisticated European civilization. I would think that most of you are kind of familiar with that interpretation of the Tempest. But if not, very quickly, what we have is Prospero Miranda, two Italians who come to this island who dispossess the indigenous, in fact not quite indigenous population, but the people that they find there. And there's this character called Caliban, which is very close to cannibal, who makes very strong claims that it is his island and he's been dispossessed by Prospero with the aid of his magic, and he refers to his magic as his art and his books, a very European thing. And he famously says, "This island's mine by Sycorax, my mother, which thou takest from me." So it's a very powerful voice of the dispossessed people. There are all sorts of problems with such a reading. For one, Sycorax and Caliban are explicitly said to be African, not American, and the island is in the Mediterranean because the ship that gets shipwrecked is coming back from Tunis to presumably Naples. Some of the meta-dramatic aspects of the play are at odds with the island being in the New World, as the island is likened at times to the theatre, and the transformation the characters undergo made analogous to the transformations offered by dramatic art. Finally, one of the sources that Shakespeare is said to have used, that by Strachey, who was involved in the expeditions to Jamestown in 1607, was published a long time after the Tempest was first performed. So it's kind of just assumed that the text was already circulating in London at the time. The pamphlet Pimlico certainly helps us with some of this. Its author must have known about the Strachey account, and if the speculative connection between Pimlico and America, and Pimlico Sound and all that, is correct, that would seem likely that he would know about Strachey's account. There are a good many elements at the level of plot that link Pimlico to the Tempest. Hoxton, like Caliban's Island, is an enchanted isle in the poem Pimlico, where people change their states temporarily. Such changes of state include apparent madness, real drunkenness, being soothed by the beauties of nature, and being subjected to spectacles, including music, that can be experienced both as harmonious beauty and fearful sights and sounds. The Lord of the Misrule has difficulty in keeping order, but is ultimately successful in redemptively bringing people together. The references to travel and the New World in both Pimlico and the Tempest suggest the possibility of redemption and change before a return is made to the Old World, or in the case of Pimlico, the city. The wondrous Isle of Pimlico, like Caliban's Island and Virginia or America itself, offers a fresh space for personal transformation, even though the old world problems of power and order gradually become apparent. Shakespeare and the author of Pimlico are not simply using some of the same accounts of the New World, but are imagining them in similar ways. Most crucially, perhaps, the Enchanted Isle, based heavily on descriptions of the New World, is relocated in the poem Pimlico to the London suburbs, the places, let's not forget, of the theatres, still Shoreditch almost as much in 1609 as Bankside, and also relocated to the Mediterranean. This last point solves the main difficulty in the post-colonial reading of the Tempest, that Caliban's Island is placed explicitly in the Mediterranean. Shakespeare already had a precedent for this double placement in the account of the tavern at Hoxton. We've already seen that there is a possible, probable personal connection between the name of the tavern Pimlico and the failed colony of Roanoke. Such a connection suggests that the colonial imagery of Pimlico is more than simply metaphorical, but is woven into the fabric of everyday life. Further, it suggests that the relationship between the old and new worlds was already one of exchange on many levels, and that England was not simply looking to export settlers and import resources, but was also importing the concept of a different world, if not to the centre of its capital, then to its suburbs. Again, this must inform our understanding of how the Tempest deals with source material related to the New World. America, or Virginia, is in the Mediterranean, but it is also a place not 1 mile from the city's walls, slightly beyond that symbolic line of demarcation, but certainly not a month's journey by sea. I think there's one further set of evidence on which conjectures about the relationship between the Tempest and Pimlico can reasonably be made, that may help to us to understand this relationship and this kind of nexus of New World sources, Shakespeare's play and this poem. The subtitle of the poem, Run, Redcap, is a quotation from Decker's play, Satyromastix, where it appears to be used as a derogatory address to one Michael Drayton. Drayton, so a writer, co-authored a play with Anthony Munday called Mother Redcap, for which Henslowe played a total of £6 in the 1597-98 season. This play is now lost, unfortunately, but there is a possible analogue for it in a poem called The Moon Calf, published much later in a miscellaneous volume in 1627. In this poem, 3 midwives, or gossips, sit round drinking at the birth of hideous, deformed twins, and decide each to tell an allegorical story, each guessing the meaning of the others. Mother Redcap's story concerns a sinful island where the only good man, who's termed in this poem a wizard, has prophesied a great tempest that will disturb the natural order of things. The storm comes to pass, and the wizard shelters himself from the deluge in a cave in a huge rock. When the storm finishes, the man goes out and sees a bedlam nation, a woman farrows piglets, someone who's mistaken his neighbour for a horse, a man worships an ape, The wizard preaches repentance, but the islanders in fact blame him for their troubles, and he is forced to retreat, hermit-like, to his cave. It cannot be proven that Drayton's poem is an analogue for his earlier play, but it is a reasonable conjecture. Intriguingly, there are clear similarities between the plot of Mother Redcap's tale and that of The Tempest, which I hope you picked up in my description. In addition, the title of the poem, Mooncalf, meaning congenital idiot or deformed animal monster, is used several times by Stefano and Tripolo to address Caliban in Acts 2 and 3 of The Tempest. And the deformed progeny, because these midwives and gossips are waiting for these twins to arrive. The deformed progeny is compared by one of the midwives to African issue. She says, Africa, that said mother of monsters is, let her but show me just a one as this. While the location of the island in Redcap's tale is explicitly not stated, it is most often and very often compared to Bedlam, and particularly to the disreputable pastimes of the suburbs. So, for example, it says, but in that continent there was a noise as if the garden bears and all the dogs together by the ears, and those of Bedlam had enlarged been, and behold, the baiting had come in. So the island after this storm, which upsets the natural order, is compared to Bedlam. It's also compared to the kind of bear and dog baiting that also goes on in the suburbs of London. So scenes of madness and the inversion of the natural and social order are thus transposed to the leisurely and horrific suburbs in this poem. We cannot, unfortunately, know what the relationship between Drayton's poem and his play might be, nor hence that between Pimlico and Drayton's play. Yet, there is a nexus of topographical imagery that links the Mooncalf to Pimlico and in turn to the Tempest. The journey, the storm, the tumultuous suburb as enchanted island, the lord who despite his magic cannot quite keep order, and the conditional promise of change through the experiences possible on this enchanted island, stroke theatre, stroke suburb. It was not long before Pimlico and Hoxton became respectable, as it seems to be happening now. They are mentioned as being a pleasant place of resort in a number of texts from the mid-17th century onwards, so that by 1699, a dictionary of slang described Pimlico as a bowling green of good report at Hoxton. Perhaps our poem Pimlico is nostalgic in nature, but despite its triumphalist tone towards the end, the real action had moved on from the ritualistic, drunken street drama to the purpose-built theatres. So it moved from the taverns with their kind of natural, ritualistic drama to organised mimetic theatres. And still more from the northeastern suburbs, Shoreditch, to Bankside, south of the river. But whoever the author of the poem was, he has left us with a record of a suburban space beyond the city limits, which is at times utopian, neither subject to distinctions between ranks nor to commercial exploitation, but is at times also suggestive of commercial, military, and colonial monopolisation, and a madness that has to be cured by leaving the enchanted island. We also have a glimpse here of how Shakespeare might have reworked the accounts of the New World from the Roanoke and Jamestown expeditions into a drama whose place is in Virginia, America, in the Mediterranean, but more urgently in London's suburbs. If, in the second act of The Tempest, Gonzalo is right that he could be king of a kingless isle, and that Tunis was Carthage, then Tunis might as well be Virginia or Hoxton too, with the mysterious Ben Pimlico, the Pimliconian brewer, as its lawless lawgiver. Now, I mean, we were going to sort of, you know, have sort of suggest a discussion. I don't know whether people want to do that or want to kind of take the discussion to the I don't know, does anyone want to ask any questions of me or Matt, who directed it at the back? Unfortunately, Jack's had to get back to Brighton because his daughter's got an A-level tomorrow. He sort of feels he has to be there. But I don't know if there are any responses or any rebuttals.
Do we know anything about the person who wrote this poem?
No.
Okay.
I think he's a wit. He's knowledgeable about the area, so he might have lived in Shoreditch or around here somewhere.
Sure.
But I mean, it's an unusual poem, and it's usually described as being street literature or popular literature. It's a medley poem, so the whole pamphlet is a medley of various different things. It's got kind of verse incantation, and it's got prose introduction about the island, and then it's got sort of long sections of poetry interspersed with quotations from Tunnon and a Run by John Skelton. And it's typical. There are quite a lot of texts which are about London texts which are about journeys, and they're called wager journeys. So it's journeys to, it's one about Kingston, and a journey to, where is it, I think Deptford. So, you know, it's like them. It's actually much more learned than them, but who wrote it? Nobody knows.
Who would the audience or audiences be for that sort of poem?
I mean, again, I don't know. There's, as far as I know, there's very little external reference to it, apart from it just being entered in the what's it called, the stationers, Senator Stations Hall. I mean, I had a theory that actually, in some ways, it's an advertisement for this beer and this tavern. It was of course quite common just to stick these things up on the wall. So that's possible. But I don't know. It's a drollery. It's a bit of a laugh, as well as being, you know, money ways interesting and learning too. So, you know, who doesn't like a bit of a laugh?
Peter, apropos of nothing really, have you seen Passport to Pimlico the film? Which is where it's, you know, it's actually found out that Pimlico, the other Pimlico, is part of France, and you have to.
Oh really?
Yeah.
I've heard of it, but I've never.
Which, you know, it's just
never.
It's fascinating actually to think of places, you know, separate within a big town like that.
Yeah, I mean, the place near Westminster became called Pimlico because there was a kind of leisure garden which was like another Pimlico, so it just got transferred there. That line, another Pimlico, is a line from Ben Jonson's The Alchemist, and the first reference to the place in Westminster as being Pimlico is, I think, late 17th, early 18th century.
So our Pimlico is a fake, effectively. The Pimlico we know in London is a fake.
Yeah,
that's the real one.
The Westminster, well, it's a, you know, you know, to get copied, don't you? It's like that New York is a bit real. But it's not the original Pimlico. But of course, where the names come from, it has been persuasively argued that this name actually comes from, well, it has something to do with the Pamlico Sound in North Carolina, the Panticoff, Native Americans who found that by the English.
The original poem, you say, was a pamphlet, so it was meant to be read, not to be heard or performed.
Well, I think there was. I mean, I think our culture is quite unusual in having an idea of a book that you curl up with on your own. But reading is quite a sort of private experience. People did read stuff out aloud. You know, there are all these things like, you know, the average newspaper in the early 18th century was read by, the average single copy was read by 40 people or something like that. So I don't know. I think if the question you're asking is the performance there in the poem, no, I mean, there aren't stage directions. But I think it is a piece of oratory. You know, it's a piece of rhetoric. It's, as Jack and Matt so skillfully did, they brought out how it could be.
Because if it's meant like for a laugh or as an advertisement, maybe you'll reach more people in that kind of area who are a bit drunk.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Rather than handing out.
I mean, yes, absolutely, exactly. I mean, it could have actually been performed in that tavern.
Yeah.
Or in a rival tavern.
Yeah.
Pleasure garden sounds like a more elaborate thing than tavern.
Yeah.
Have we any idea what scale this was on?
No, we don't, I'm afraid. I mean, he in the poem it says, "I went into their park." So you know there is a beer garden, and then outside it there is Hoxton Fields as well, which is the site of St John's Church, St John of something Church, which is just by Pitfield Street. That's where this duel to Gabriel Spencer and Ben Jonson was fought. I'm probably using the term leisure or pleasure gardens because I'm actually an 18th centuryist, and of course that's the era of Vauxhall pleasure gardens and that sort of thing. But certainly there's a tavern and some kind of yard and beer garden.
Could a beer garden be a beer garden?
Sorry, say that again?
Could a beer garden be a beer garden as well?
Well, it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, again, I think beer garden is my modern term. Yeah, the descriptions are of a large place certainly with some outside space. Are we all done then? Well, listen, is there any? Okay, well listen, thanks so much for coming. Really, thank you. But there is some spare drink that we didn't manage to hand out to him. So if you want a quick swig of fine, not